This is fabulous. I don't think I've ever been in anything like it before. With 700 registrations, with the registrations closed, 2 or 3 weeks before, with people coming from, 35 countries, I was told. It's just ridiculous. It's so nice. And the question is really, well, why? Why are you here? Why are we here? What brought you so far? And I think the first answer I have is anger. And you don't look particularly angry, you actually look quite happy. Saying hello to friends and meeting new friends. But I think that probably we're all aware that behind that there is a deep anger that brings you here. Anger against the militarization of the world. Anger against all that William and Sylvia and Mireille have been talking about. Anger against the warming of the planet that threatens us all with suffering and possibly even extinction. Anger against the dehumanizing treatment of migrants, which is growing more and more horrible. Anger against femicides that are increasing in all the world. So I think we're here because we all feel at some level a kind of a deep anger against the world that we're living in. But of course it's not just anger, it's also hope. Hope, we didn't come here just because we're angry. We came here because we still have hope that we can create something different. Hope is our great pushing force. Not a happy, happy hope, but an angry hope. Not an empty, wishful thinking, but a determined, reasoned hope that we can, must, and will change the world. It's anger and it's hope. And it's really only in the last few weeks that I've been thinking as well in terms of a different word, a different category. Because I think that with the growing fear that we probably all feel, then perhaps we have to think in terms of desperation. I was invited to speak at the meeting that the Zapatistas organized at the end of December on resistances and rebellions. Fantastic honor. But I wasn't able to go because I was ill. Very sad. But there was one word. I did follow it, of course. I followed it fairly closely on streaming. And there was one word that Marcus used just at the end of his last intervention. Desperation. That capitalism generates desperation in all sorts of ways. At a personal level, the deep and growing uncertainty of life. How can I get into the university? What will I do afterwards? How can I get a job? What sort of world will my children live in? Or does it make sense to even think of having children? How can I find somewhere decent to live? There's that desperation that goes through all of society. And of course, the growing social desperation. Look what is happening to migrants. Look at the destruction of the biodiversity that human life depends on. Look at global warming. Look at the genocide in Gaza. Look at the growing danger of more wars. Anger, hope. But anger and hope against the background of a despair that we will not accept. Because desperation is not despair. Desperation, as I understand it, is a refusal to despair, a refusal to give up our anger, and a refusal to give up our hope, even when it seems that there is no hope at all. Even when it seems that we are mad to keep on thinking that a different world is possible. In the dictionaries, desperation is often equated with despair, but it's not that. And I found one definition that comes closer to what we feel, that says, desperate, showing a willingness to take any risk in order to change a bad or dangerous situation. I don't know about any risk, but certainly desperation for me means a fury to change a bad or dangerous situation, a determination to change a disaster, to change this disaster that is capitalism. Desperation to change the world because we know that it doesn't have to be like that. Because we know that that is not inevitable. Because we know that we have the capacity to create something else. So desperation includes frustration, frustration of what we could do, frustration of our richness, of our creative capacity, of our capacity to create something different. Richness is very important for me. To think about the possibility of changing the world, we have to have confidence in our own richness. We have to start thinking not from poverty, but from richness. And what I see here, you, is not a multitude of poverties, but a fantastic coming together of richnesses from many different places. And that is what will make the conference very special. That is what it will make this meeting take fire. We must build on our richnesses, not on our poverties. That's where the slogan comes from that is on the screen behind me. Organize our desperation. That is the call that I take from Marcus's speech. And to organize our desperation means also to organize our anger, to organize our hope, to organize our frustration, to organize our richness. No? And I think that is why we are here this weekend. If I mention the Zapatistas so much, and I'm going to mention them a couple of times more, it is not because I represent them in any way at all. It is simply because I admire them very much, and also because I think that their voice should be present in such a terrific meeting of resistances and rebellions. So desperation is a determination to change a bad or dangerous situation. And I think this is where we are. We are in a very bad and dangerous situation. A situation that the Zapatistas called the storm, la tormenta. We can feel it all around us. We've been hearing all about it this morning. We can feel it all around us. We can hear the winds howling more and more loudly with each day that passes. And we know that it is likely to get much worse, that it could lead to much greater catastrophe. Desperation, then, is hope in the storm. It is hope in and against the storm. It is hope in, against, and beyond the storm. I think that's why the concept is attracting me so much. It is because it's going beyond. We have hope all the time. We have anger all the time. That is our relation to the world around us, the world that dominates us. But now, to talk of desperation, I think we're thinking in a specific historical context, the context of the storm, the capitalist storm. And we don't just want to survive the storm. We want to stop it. We want to create something else. In Marcus's speech, he imagines a telephone conversation with a young girl who lives in the future, 120 years from now. Because, of course, the Zapatista conference has the support of digitally sophisticated supporters. No? And these digitally sophisticated comrades set up a connection for the commandantes with a community in the year 2145. They make a phone call into the future, and it is a young girl who answers the phone. And Marcus asks her, "How are you?" And the girl replies, "It depends." So Marcus swears, thinking, no, at least he could have had the good fortune that an adult would answer the phone. So he says, "What sort of an answer is that when I ask you, how are you?" And the girl answers, "It depends on you." And that's the end of the conversation. So it depends on you. That means it depends on us, on our ability to organize our desperation, to organize the desperation that has brought us all here today. the sort of life that our great-great-great-grandchildren will lead. And indeed, the question of whether they ever will exist at all depends on us. So desperation is a scream. I think probably at some point, everybody in this hall, I imagine, will have screamed, no, the world cannot be like that. It cannot be true. We cannot accept this. No. Just to think of Gaza, just to see pictures of the destruction is to scream. To see what Trump and the new right throughout the world are saying and doing and proposing is to feel a scream rising up inside us. We are here to voice that scream and to strengthen that scream. And that scream is our scream. It is the scream that we are articulating here, but it is a scream that must be heard and is heard in every town and city that we come from. Of course, we focus it on an organization. Sometimes we focus it on struggles that are taking place somewhere else. But what counts above all is the force of our scream in the places where we live. In Dublin, or Belgrade, or Athens, or Berlin, or wherever you've come from. So organize our desperation, organize our scream. But there's a tension there, a tension that perhaps we can feel already, because sometimes our scream does not want to be organized. It just wants to scream. And an organization that dulls the scream, an organization that tells it to be quiet, is no longer the voice of our desperation. To quote Marcus's talk in Chiapas again, desperation has reasons that reason ignores. In any organization, desperation will probably be a rebel. To organize desperation is to harness a wild horse. But if the wildness is lost, then there is no point in harnessing it. And I think desperation is necessarily our starting point for thinking of radical change in this moment, but it is also dangerous and unpredictable. After the race riots in South Africa in 2020, Abahlali Basim Munjondola, the important shack dwellers group there, movement, said Abahlali has always warned that the anger of the poor can go in many directions. We have warned again and again that we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. That is why it is important to organize the desperation and to think. Desperation has reasons that reason ignores. The anger of the poor, the desperation of the poor, can go in many directions in the world at the moment. There is a growing social desperation generated by the horrors of the dominant form of social organization, the rule of money, the rule of capital. But we know that it is going in the wrong direction, intensifying the horrors of the system instead of rectifying them. Fascism or neo-fascism is not a noun, not a pre-constituted ideology, but a desperation, an anger against the system that is going in the wrong direction, strengthening the system. And we have to win this desperation back. We have to make it ours. Organize desperation then. But how? And perhaps we need to think of organization as an overflowing, as an opening. Often, organizations are understood as closures, as definitions. The state, for example, is a very powerful organization that is a closure. It is a form of organization based on the distinction between them and us. Every state is based on the distinction between foreigners and citizens. And often we just live with that as normal. But we know, in fact, that it is a murderous distinction that has led to the killing of millions of people in the last century. A distinction, just that, the distinction between citizens and foreigners leads to the drowning of well over 1,000 people in the Mediterranean each year, and to the death of a similar number in the deserts on the border between Mexico and the US. A political party is also a form of organization that defines, that separates them from us. But of course, there are other forms of organization. We can think of organization as being open, as being moving, as being a flowing, coming together and moving out. And I imagine that this conference is just such a fantastically impressive organization. But I think of it as being a very open organization. I think that the effect of this conference, I imagine, should be like a cascade with ideas generated and discussed here being taken back to all our different places, to London or Paris or Warsaw, and to our activities, to the songs we sing, the emails we write, the seminars we attend, the software we write, and then go spreading out. In other words, we have to think of organization as something that breaks the logic of the system, that breaks the logic of definition and identification of them and us. The desperation of the right reproduces capitalism because it adopts the logic of them and us and pushes it to extremes. If our organization is symmetrical to the organization of capital, like one army fighting another, then we reproduce what we are fighting against. And in the long history of anti-capitalist struggle, there are really two traditions. There is the tradition of the instrumental, state-oriented, and therefore symmetrical organization, the tradition of parties. And on the other hand, there is the tradition that seeks to articulate anger and ideas from below, that tries to listen to people and get them to express their ideas. In other words, the tradition of the commune or council or assembly. And from all that has been said, at least from what I've understood, the drive that is very clear behind the workshops is precisely part of that council tradition. And for that reason, very important. Though, of course, for historical reasons, there are often organizations that combine the two traditions in a relation of tension that can be productive or destructive. Our desperation, then, takes different forms, as they must, because capitalism is a many-headed Hydra attacking us all the time in many different ways. For some of us, it is the attack on migrants that makes us most angry, or that we feel most directly. For some, it is the growing number of femicides. For some, the destruction of biodiversity, the militarization of society. All these things terrify us. But perhaps we decide to focus on one or the other. And I think this is reflected, again, as far as I can see from the program, in the structure of workshops in this meeting. The workshops are necessarily, I think inevitably, focused on particular themes, the rise of militarism, the rise of fascism, etc. And this focus on particular themes is necessary, but then it always raises a problem of how we move on from the particular to the universal. It is the problem of the Hydra, strike at one head and three more sprout up. As long as we live in a society dominated by money, dominated by capital, that is, as long as we live in a society in which the dominant connection between people is established through the exchange of commodities, then all these horrors will keep on recurring in one way or another, unless we can establish a society in which the social connection is achieved not through money, but through some sort of sharing, then there is probably no escape from the spiral of destruction in which we find ourselves. But how do we do it? I think we have to start from the particular and overflow. And I think there's perhaps a change in the direction of thinking, or thinking about organization as well. That the old tradition really says, well, the real problem is capitalism. And unless you see that, then you are just being reformist. And I think now we have to start the other way around, and we do start the other way around with people's more immediate concerns. The fight to stop the destruction of biodiversity, to stop the use of fossil oil, to bring racism to an end. But then we have to overflow. I suppose that's really what we want to do, what we need to do. We need to overflow and say, yes, we will do everything possible to stop the extinction of plants and animals, But by the way, the only way really to stop the destruction of biodiversity is to abolish the power of money. And this means abolishing money as a social connection and creating something else. And I think of that as a sort of PS politics, a politics of postscriptum, to our particular struggles, in which we focus, yes, on the particular struggles that we're involved in, and then say, PS, by the way, in addition, we need to get rid of money to get rid of capital. In other words, not to think of ourselves as an enlightened group of revolutionary activists, separate from the masses, but to start out from the growing mass desperation in the world and overflow from there to make connections and ask questions. Because organization is always a question and never an answer. And finally, of course it's a long finally, but we want to win. And even to say that kind of seems shocking, no? Because we're used to losing, and we're used to thinking, well, we'll go on struggling, and our parents did it before us, and if all goes well, our children will do it as well. But no, we actually want to win. We want to win, and we must win. We must stop the dynamic that is destroying the world, because we really want the girl in 120 years' time to have a life and to have a rich and free life. So when I say we want to win, I'm saying not just that we must free Kurdistan, of course that, not just that we must improve indigenous rights in Chiapas or wherever. But we actually have to break capitalism. And I suppose what all the talks were doing was saying, look, this is the situation. We're now in this storm. And if we really want to think of this girl in the year 2145, then we have to break the way in which we relate to one another. We have to break capital. But breaking capital is not just breaking this force outside. Breaking capital is breaking the interconnection between human activities, breaking money, in other words, and creating something else. And this seems mad, no? And that's the point. We are mad. We are mad, and we have to assume our madness, because the only way to be human is to be mad. The only way to be human now is to say no to the inhumanity of capitalist society and to create something else. No. To abolish capitalism necessarily means creating something else. There's a point made by Silvia Federici, I think, as well. So it's not just a question of confrontation, it is also a question of creating something else. If we think of capitalism as a form of human interconnectedness, then obvious, if we want to get rid of that form of interconnectedness, necessarily we have to create a different form of interconnection. No? In other words, we can abolish capitalism only by creating other ways of relating to one another, other forms of social connection, which is what they're doing in Rojava, no? What the Zapatistas are doing in Chiapas, and what a million smaller groups are doing throughout the world. It's not enough. We haven't got there yet. But we have to push on in creating some sort of common sharing in all areas of human activity, some sort of commoning, some sort of communizing. Sometimes I feel that we're like Sisyphus. We're kind of pushing rocks up a hill, and often it feels that we are condemned to do that forever. But no, we can't accept that. We are pushing up, and we want to reach a tipping point. And as we go, we find two things. Firstly, that it is more difficult than we thought, that the summit of the hill keeps on retreating. But also, as we go, we find that this capitalism that we want to surmount is actually much more fragile than it appears to be, because it is built on an ever-expanding debt, because it is unable to generate enough surplus value for its own expansion. So that the existence, the growth of capitalism is increasingly based on a fictition, and this fiction could well collapse very quickly, as it did in 2007, 2008. But now, possibly on a much greater scale. The crisis of 2007, 2008 was something that changed radically our perception of what is possible and what is not possible, though not necessarily in the direction we want. But clearly what is happening in the world at the moment is something we would have dismissed as being totally impossible just a few years ago. And that can change in our direction too, that what we now think of being impossible, actually we suddenly realize is very possible in 2 or 3 years' time. So in this storm, we are pushing rocks up the hill and trying to reach a tipping point, the summit of the hill, where the rocks will roll down and gather pace, and more people will see that what we are saying is simply common sense. That of course we must get rid of capitalism, of course we must create something else before we come too close to extinction. And here we are in this fabulous meeting, pushing rocks up the hill, building our strength and overflowing, because we know we must win, we must create a different world. That, I think, is what we will be doing in the workshops, pushing and pushing towards the tipping point, knowing that this time we must and we will win. Thank you very much.